because I actually think I even heard someone say one time that she had never even heard of an adrenal gland, and was it even a real thing? It is a real thing. But I feel like maybe we never really understood this until recently. And I don't know what you think about that, but we've heard the terms, right? Adrenal fatigue, the adrenal gland, thyroid health. We think it must be important because we hear about it all the time, but we don't really know what it means. So
Right.
we want kind of the primer. So
Yes,
tell
yes.
us.
Yes, that's so, I love that you said that. People don't even know what the adrenal gland is. And that's so true because people are so tuned out of their body. Like,
Yeah.
so a big part of being a doctor is teacher, docere, as we call it in naturopathic medicine. So I'm always teaching patients about their body, like what is this gland or what does this do? So the adrenal gland is a little tiny gland. It's shaped like a little pyramid. It sits on top of the kidneys. And it has some major functions. And to break it down like super easy, it's like salt, sugar, and sex. So it
Hmm.
controls aldosterone. So it controls that as part of our blood pressure regulation system. It controls sex. So it controls our sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. It also controls salt, sugar. It controls our sugar. So the hypoglycemia or blood sugar balance. So
Mm.
it's a big piece of adrenal fatigue in that section. It also controls our epinephrine and norepinephrine and that cortisol component. So the adrenal gland is a huge component of how our body functions. And so just kind of like breaking it down to that helps people and listeners and you and
Yeah.
myself to understand like the basics of it. Because when we break it, anytime we break an organ down to more simple terms, like, oh, that makes sense. Salt, sugar, sex. Got
Absolutely. Yes,
it.
absolutely. And I'm thinking, wow, I see why that's so important. Like those are
Right.
major things. Yeah.
Super important. Yes.
Yeah. Now, what about thyroid? I think it's so common that people have a thyroid problem where they have to take thyroid medicine, but what does the thyroid do?
Right, that's a great question. So, the thyroid's claim to fame is metabolism, but it is way more involved in that. And one thing I always like to bring up is, from the emotional perspective, when we're thinking about the energetics of the organs, the thyroid is all about communication. And as women, we've been shut down from our communication system for a long period of time, like speaking out, saying how we truly feel, our own voice. And that's a huge part of the communication aspect energetically of the thyroid. So that's one component that's really important. And the other piece is the thyroid has a lot to do with the immune system. One piece is like for, you could say, like a Hashimoto's or some autoimmune conditions with the thyroid gland, but it's also highly connected to the HPA axis. So that's the hypothalamus in the brain.
Mhm.
We have the pituitary gland in the brain, and
Yes.
then the adrenal system. So this goes three. Like, I don't know if your listeners are. Is this YouTube? I don't can't
It
remember.
will, yeah, yes, it
Okay.
will be available
Okay,
on
good.
YouTube.
Okay, great. Well, I'm showing like so we have our brain, and then we have the thyroids in our throat, and then the adrenals are in the kidneys in the back. So why I'm bringing this up is because the thyroid is a huge piece of that system, and that's a feedback loop system. So when one
Ah,
communication, the pituitary gland and the brain, which really is the biggest hormone releaser, it tells all the organs all the hormones. It tells the thyroid what to do. It tells the adrenal glands what to do. It tells the ovaries what to do. So when that system, or the feedback loop, starts to get disrupted, everything goes haywire. So we can
mm,
think about the adrenal gland as kind of, I like to think of it as like the mini mothership, right? We're talking about we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are like the huge, big motherships. So we got the mini mothership, and it's telling our body how to regulate everything from the
okay.
metabolism point of view. Does that help to make sense kind of how that works?
Yes, absolutely. I love that you brought it all together. And I love that we're talking about this in language that is kind of everyday accessible language. Because when we get too big medical wordy
That's right.
about it, then, it feels like we're reading a textbook. So
Yes.
thank you for that. Now, if we are dealing with issues related to the adrenals, how does that show up? What are some things we might notice?
Right. And this is one piece I think that why the typical medical world doesn't, like in the MD world, doesn't acknowledge or doesn't understand, I guess, the aspect of adrenal fatigue. They haven't, one is it's not really taught in their realm of thought in the typical medical model. But the signs and symptoms of adrenal fatigue are very wide, right? And same with thyroid conditions. So thyroid's a little bit easier to diagnose, but adrenal fatigue can be harder to diagnose unless you're looking at an adrenal panel, and that's not run in a typical medical lab work. So that's why it's not really recognized in that way. So some of the symptoms can be, of course, fatigue, and that can be range from, I feel kind of tired to all the way till I can't get out of bed. Complete exhaustion. So there's a big range there. So low energy levels, of course. We're talking about sometimes respiratory conditions as well, like having problems breathing, elevated heart rate, and that's also with thyroid conditions. Panic attacks, that's often common with adrenal fatigue. We see rough skin or dry skin, another thing with the thyroid. There's a lot of crossovers.
Yes.
Low blood pressure, like I mentioned earlier, because remember the aldosterone component with the salt. And so the adrenal glands regulate blood pressure. So if we have a consistent blood pressure issues, that's a big sign, not necessarily as high, that sometimes more can be with the thyroid, with hypothyroidism, but especially for adrenal fatigue, we see a lot of low blood pressure as the adrenals start to decrease in function. Inflammation is a huge one, because getting back to, we didn't really talk about the other component of like why it even happens. But when we have adrenal fatigue, it's because you're basically, cortisol is your stress hormone, and that gets overactivated as you're burned out. And so a piece of cortisol is inflammation. So a lot of times when patients are in a state of adrenal fatigue, they have a lot of chronic inflammation, joint pain, things like that can manifest in different ways. So inflammation of the gut, inflammation of the thyroid again. So we'll see it, sometimes it can be systemic inflammation, sometimes it can just be in one area. So it crosses over. So muscle, joint pain, inflammation, those are really common things as well. Those are kind of like the major ones.
So it's interesting because you're listing off things and I'm sitting here thinking, oh my, I have some of those things. And when I sat here and thought that, I realized these are symptoms that could happen for a variety of reasons, right?
That's what I was saying, right? And I didn't even talk about weight gain and weight loss, which is also with the thyroid as well. That's also adrenal fatigue. Yeah. So that's a tricky piece. So when a patient comes in, of course, that's the diagnostic tool, right? Looking to see these symptoms, and there's other kind of things we want to measure about, what's going on in their life, that stress component. So I'll usually do, a stress intake form. How's your stress? How's your anxiety? How you're dealing with it? And then calculate it kind of like a scale that gives me an idea. Also, I have one for the thyroid. And then from there, I would do functional medicine testing. That's going to show me like an adrenal panel. How's your cortisol? Are you waking up in the morning and it's totally in the toilet? Are you going to bed at night and it's skyrocketing? You can't sleep. Are you waking up, all through the night? You can't sleep, insomnia. I mean, there's all different levels in there that can help kind of direct more towards the actual like diagnosis of adrenal fatigue.
Okay, right. That makes sense because it could mean so many different things. And I dare say most of us nowadays are dealing with always low levels of stress and always a little bit of this, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. And that's why there's levels of adrenal fatigue. There's three main levels. And so kind of if you can think about like you're at level 1, you're just in this kind of state of low energy, you're having some chronic stress, but you're fine. You're functioning, right? Maybe you just need a little support. But then and then stage 2 is chronic and like you're tired and wired, right? So it's like you can't go to sleep at night. You're so wired, but all through the day, you're just totally tired. Then stage 3 is like you're just completely exhausted, no matter what you do. It's just like so it's like there's those 3 phases. So that can help kind of, most of us I think are a lot of times in stage 1, unless we're doing a lot of self-care and supplements and herbs and things that help as support our chronic stress.
Right. Absolutely. And we're going to get into, okay, what could I do in case anyone's feeling like me and going, oh my gosh, like, I don't know if this is me, what should I do? But before we do that, because we said adrenal and thyroid, is it the case that thyroid issues are a little different? Because sometimes it seems like there actually is something that really does require medication when the thyroid's not functioning.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So the thyroid in itself, we're looking at, there's a lot of signs and symptoms that can come up with thyroid. And one piece of that is, of course, fatigue. I'll see that a lot with patients, hair loss, dry skin, and we can have hypo or hyperthyroidism. So there's two sides of the coin. We can have, you'll see like kind of like bulging eyes a little bit. You can see hair loss, super common, also common with adrenal fatigue. So when someone comes in to me and I'm seeing some of these signs, I usually, when my patients are coming into me to work with their hormones usually anyway, they're like coming to me is like they already can sense some things are going on. So I'll run these panels right away so that I can use my diagnostic tool. I'm like, okay, let's do the thyroid, because there's lots of pieces with a thyroid panel that will show if the thyroid is really functioning well or not. Just TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which comes from the pituitary gland in the brain, like I talked about.
All connected.
Yeah, all connected. Only shows us one thing about the thyroid. It only shows, and a lot of those numbers have been adjusted by the AMA and the medical community, which are very out of range for, especially if a female either look at fertility or a woman that's in menopause, or there's lots of things that those numbers can be way out of range for them, but what on a typical lab test will look normal. Then we want to make sure we're looking at the other components, which are like T3 and T4 and the antibodies. So T3 and T4 are about the communication, that feedback loop that I talked about that goes back up to the brain. So it's basically telling the brain like, hey, I'm functioning great. Or no, I'm functioning really bad, right? And so then the brain says, sweet, I'm going to tell you what to do. So it's this constant thing back and forth. But if that is never tested in a lab, component of functional lab test, we don't know what that communication is, and that can be like, it's like an error, communication breakdown. And so we want to make sure. And then the other component is the thyroid antibodies. We have to test the thyroid antibodies to see if there is an autoimmune condition of the thyroid gland, because that's a whole different aspect of treatment for a person, a listener, anyone out there, because we want to see like, okay, you got this autoimmune component coming in. How are we going to address that? So your question was about medication. So levothyroxine is a common medication that's often prescribed for Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism. And honestly, I've been seeing it's given out a lot like candy, unfortunately. And because the lab work will be done, just basics, and then that TSH will be out of alignment, and a doctor will just give that out without running the other aspects of the test. And then also without looking at the other pieces of the components of the person's life, like we mentioned, the adrenal gland, the other hormones, stress, nutrition, all these pieces that as a naturopathic physician I look at. So what happens then, once the levo is brought in, that levothyroxine, the thyroid gland then kind of gives up, right? So it's like, okay, I don't need to work anymore. Somebody else is doing my job for me.
Oh.
And so that is really challenging for a woman to then, support herself and then get off of levo if she wants to in the future. Like I'll have patients that come in and say, hey, I've been on levo for like 10 years. I'm like, okay, well, we have to really support you and slowly taper you off before we're willing to go into that route of no levo. So I always recommend listeners out there, if your doctor's suggesting levo, make sure you're, looking into all of your options and choices, because it's not, of course it can be helpful for someone who really needs it, but you also want to make sure it's the right choice for you in all situations anyway.
Right. And absolutely, we're not saying don't see your doctor, see your doctor, see your naturopathic doctor,
Exactly.
look at all the choices.
Yes.
Exactly.
Look at all the choices, yes, because you are in charge of your own health and you need to know your choices. And if you're giving an option or answer that you don't like, please seek out other medical care. Right. Because we all have, as doctors, we all have our own kind of opinions, and we're taught and learn and education all different ways, right? So we're going to be using our best advice, but if that doesn't sit with you, then look elsewhere, and get a second opinion, the one that resonates with you and is going to help serve you the best.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. So let me come back to cortisol for just a second, because
cortisol, over it. It's like a cortisol speed bump.
I know. Because everybody knows what cortisol is. It's talked about enough now that we know it's the stress thing. But is it really kind of the big bad guy here? Is this what tends to kick off a lot of these problems? It kind of sounds like that.
Right. Yes. Well, we don't always want to not think, as we mentioned earlier, that our hormones are not the bad guys.
True, true,
Right.
true.
Yes. But so what happens with cortisol is that it's in a relationship, right? It's in this loving relationship with estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, has this balancing act that it's always doing. But sometimes cortisol takes the tennis ball in its own court, or it becomes this like single dance partner, right? And so it wants to control the team. And when that happens, the other hormones are not happy, right? And so that's when we start to see things like DHEA, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone all start to have problems. And that's why doing other testing is really important, because cortisol, you have to see how cortisol is playing with those other factors. And so
Hmm.
cortisol isn't necessarily the bad guy, but when it starts to take the lead, just like if you have a bad boss in your firm or something, or I don't know, somebody that's in control of the ship that you don't want to be in control, that's when really things start to go awry. So you want to make sure, so if cortisol is a stress hormone, you want to make sure that you have those ways to handle stress in your life.
Yes.
And how do recognizing stress is number one. And a lot of us are in denial about how stress affects us. So recognizing it, understanding how it affects us, then having the tools to learn how to manage it and to decrease it, and seeking out help if you need it, right? And so I think, because like we mentioned at the very beginning, we had a lot of stress as a planet over the
Hmm.
past couple
Oh my
years with the
gosh.
pandemic and just all kinds of things. So I've seen the adrenal fatigue and the way that patients have anxiety and stress and depression have really increased over the past 3 years. So yeah, seek out if you need mental health
Yeah.
help. Seek it out, right? Or if you need help from your health practitioner, or if you need maybe massage helps you relax, whatever it is.
Right.
I have a toolbox, right? And so that's a piece with adrenal fatigue and thyroid conditions that I help my patients with. You got to have a toolbox. You're like, okay, this is happening, go to the toolbox, right? So you know how to support yourself. That's an empowerment piece of health.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so, what kinds of things do you ask your patients on related to stress when you're trying to figure out how much stress they're under? And I ask that just to see, how could we kind of determine that for ourselves?
Right. Yes. So that first of all comes back to like an intake form that's going to show me the stress that someone has happened over their lifetime. Right. And like, okay, on this timeline of health, what are the circumstances that you've happened on a trauma scale that have been so
Mm.
exponential that's still affecting you? That could be, the top stressors: grief, loss, moving,
Hmm.
change in job, financial loss, family, like all the traumas. So in those pieces, I ask patients, so how's your stress on a scale of 1 to 10, right? How's your financial situation? How's your
Mm.
family? Do you have support in your family system? How's your relationship with your family members and your children? How's your job? How are you happy with your job? How's the stress at your job? I mean, all the ways that people have, and how's your stress with your health? I mean, that's a huge one, right? Do you have
Yeah.
anxiety about your health? Are you worried about your health? What's your stress level with your health? Are you talking to others about your health? So health is a big one, especially when they're coming to me. That's a big stress
Right.
factor. So those are some of the kinds of questions you want to. But I look at the trauma stress timeline and see how many things are really like, oh gosh, wow, this looks like this was a really stressful life for you. How are you handling it? How are you managing it? What have you brought into your life to help deal with that? Have you sought out help to help you deal with the trauma that you've had for your nervous system?
Yeah, and the reason I asked that, and great helpful answer, was so that maybe listeners can kind of say, "Oh, I didn't think I was stressed, but maybe let me evaluate that," because some of this could be just kind of low lying. We don't even notice, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So we can think about like stress is cumulative. And there's two different types of stress. We have acute stress, which we want to have an acute response, like whatever that would be. We have some dangerous situation when we want to
Hmm.
respond acutely. Yes, you did a great job, body. And that's where the cortisol comes in, and the adrenaline and
Yes.
epinephrine. And then we have chronic stress. So that's, like you said, that low levels. It can be also higher levels that are
Hmm.
chronic, happening continually over time. And that's when that cortisol level is, increase a little bit. It's increase a little bit more, a little bit more, a
Mm.
little bit more, right? As our body's trying to adjust to this chronic state of stress. And so that's the differences between the acute stress and the chronic stress are really a big part of awareness from the patients, from my perspective, but also the patient's perspective, right? Like, and doing some things like a sheet, a piece of paper where you could divide it in half and say like, okay, what are some of my acute stressors? And what are some of my chronic stressors? Just listing them and just being aware, like, oh yeah, okay. Maybe some cute one is like, I don't know, neighbors' dogs barking next door during a podcast. Like that could be an acute stressor. But a chronic stressor could be something, maybe it's financial stress where you just have no money in your bank account, right? It's like, and you can't make the ends meet no matter what you do. That's very stressful for people. And so, having a list of that, and let's say you had on one side the acute stressors were, very minor, maybe just like occasional things, but maybe on that, like a chronic stress, maybe you have like 20 things like, oh, okay, there's a lot of things affecting my system and how am I responding? So that can be, awareness about our health is just the biggest key, and stress. And there's lots of tools out there, journaling, meditation, breath work. I think our community and the world is really expanding on the tools that we're providing for people for calm, peace, relaxation.
Yes, absolutely. And to be honest, as we're recording this, I don't remember if it has already happened or will happen, but I'm going to do an episode on meditation. So,
nice.
Listeners, catch that one.
That's great. Yeah, meditation is a huge, huge component of my own life, and I recommend it to patients all the time. I started meditating in like 1999, like really started meditating, not dabbling, and I wouldn't live without it. Like, people, I think everyone that knows me knows how much it does for my life and just the way that I look. Like, my health is a big part of that too. It's like, it changes everything.
That's amazing. Okay. So we kind of got into it a little bit. This is just flowing exactly how I wanted it to. What can we do if we get into these situations where our adrenals are fatigued, whether it's in a minor way or headed towards major? I feel like you're going to tell us there's some different ways we can eat and things we might be able to take, and maybe different habits as well, right? So tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So one piece of adrenal fatigue that I find really important, especially in a person that's maybe thinking, audience and listeners out there, thinking like the type A personality, right? Like, you're like, go, go, go. You just never have that moment to like even relax and have downtime. So a schedule that you stick to is very important, and having the pieces where it's just really laid out. Like, okay, I'm going to take my supplements then. I'm going to, or, in this time in the morning, I'm going to have a green drink. I'm going to eat my lunch. I'm going to have a nice dinner. I'm going to have my relaxing time at night, where it's very planned out, because when we veer off from that plan, that's when like the stress starts to come back in. So one is a schedule, and I listed a lot of kind of things in there, so we can go to those kind of more in detail. So supplements are really key. I never want my patients to be on supplements, or listeners out there to be on supplements for your life. That's not what it's about. But supplements can help your body, the cellular piece of your body, to support your system, right? So we want to get those cells like magnesium and B complex, things that are going to really help support the energy in the mitochondria to bring that adrenal system back on board. You can think of, it's like your computer and it's gone offline. We got to bring it back up. So sometimes we need a bigger jump start than others. We have herbs that are really great, like ashwagandha and rhodiola and eleutherococcus. We got, the list for adrenal support is very long, which is great. We have lots of options. So getting in a routine with your supplements and morning and nighttime, so from the nutritional piece, one, blood sugar balancing is key. We already talked about how important blood sugar is. So whether that's you're using a continuous glucose monitor or you're having a way you're tracking your blood sugar is very important. Eating a high amount of protein and eating frequent protein snacks. So I usually have my patients with adrenal fatigue eating a small protein snack every 3 to 4 hours. So way they're really helping support the system. They're not having blood sugar crashes. Eating a small piece of protein before bed, even just like a couple of walnuts, something to help that cortisol to not crash in the middle of the night or peak, depending on there's different levels there. Protein is super important. And then fat is also really important, healthy fats, because we want to support the hormone backbone, and hormone backbone is made from cholesterol. So we want to make sure we're getting our healthy fats. So that can be from omegas, salmon, walnuts, all that good stuff. So those are some kind of like basics for helping to manage adrenal fatigue. We want to make sure we're looking at the stress components, which I touched on a little bit. So having, what does that look like for you? And I think everyone is different. So that's a big piece that, I talk to patients about is compliance. So does that look like meditation for you? Some piece of calming the body. So in the morning, maybe your routine is meditation, maybe it's breath work, maybe it's visualization, maybe it's journaling, whatever it is, you got to have one thing that you're doing in the morning. And then maybe you do it in the afternoon. If you have a little break, that's a great one to add in. Like me, I like to have a little mini med time session, a little meditation where I'm just like, okay, a little med break, whether that's some nice spa music, just as a way for me to calm the system. You can probably tell I'm like a type A. I like go, go, go. And then in the evening, I have to have a total wind down. So that's what I recommend to patients. Like, what does your wind down piece be for you? Alcohol is really not a good idea for the hormones and the adrenal system as a way to wind down. And also caffeine, and sugar, caffeine, sugar, and alcohol, really not good for the adrenal system. Sorry to put the bad news out there. But
you're dashing everyone's hopes.
I know, I'm sorry. There's all kinds, and I personally even practice those things, and I know what they do to my system. And so there's other things that you can do as substitutes, which are really great. Right. But having something to wind down, so whether that is maybe a relaxing tea, maybe you're using chamomile or a nervine, whether that's passion flower, poppy, or lemon balm, or maybe you're doing kava, something a little bigger bang for the buck. There's those types of things. And then also maybe you're doing a nice Epsom salt bath, or you're doing a magnesium cream to help your muscles relax, or maybe you're doing some nice meditative visualization music. There's a schedule is really important. And that's the same for thyroid conditions. It just kind of like, changes a little bit, but it's similar.